Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 is hitting theaters this week, and in case you weren't aware, this is the 7th film in this series. Yes, the Mission Impossible movies have been around for a long time now, but the first one came out all the way back in 1996, and that got me wondering something. If the first movie came out in the mid-90s, does that mean that there was a PS1 era tie-in video game for it? Well, after a quick search, it turns out, yes, there is. But was this just a cheap cash grab? Or was this game actually pretty good? Well, let's take a few moments to explore and find out. But before we get into the game properly, we should probably discuss the history of it, because it explains a lot as to how this game ended up the way it did. Now, we don't have time here to discuss this at length. I could talk about the history of this thing for probably 20 minutes. But to put it quickly, the game was supposed to come out around the same time as the movie. Ocean Software was the company developing it. They had a history of successful licensed games, but they were developing for the Nintendo 64. It was their first game on that system, and the N64 hadn't been released yet. So they had to make a best guess as to what they thought the hardware could do, and unfortunately, they drastically overestimated what the Nintendo 64 was capable of. So that by the time they finally got their software running on the thing, it was only running at reportedly 4 frames per second. They soldiered on, they tried to make it work, but after 2 years of development and multiple delays, the parent company Infogrames finally just stepped in and said, nope, you're done, and took the thing away from them, brought it in-house. And so from that point onward, in 1997, Infogrames developed the thing. They tried to salvage what they could, but basically had to hobble together a functional game from what little they had that worked. However, it did, after another year of development, finally release in July 16th, 1998. And it did pretty well, actually. It's reported to have sold just a bit over 1 million copies in its first half a year on the market, which is respectable. Now, later on, in 1999, a PS1 port was released. This was developed by Example Architectures, a apparently German company who's known for essentially just porting this game to PlayStation, and that's it. But how is the game? Is the game any good? Well, it's okay. It's not bad. It's not great. It's just alright. One of the big differences between the N64 version and the PS1 version is the visuals. Of course, PlayStation games have more space for textures, and so this game benefits from that as improved texture work, looks more detailed. They also were able to improve the music a fair bit. One of the other big differences is the PlayStation version had FMV sequences that were pre-rendered. Now, in the N64 version, it was simply an in-game little non-playable scene. In this, they took those same character models and just basically made them in a nicer render with nicer shading and lighting, which was the style at the time. Oh, this is nice little improvements. But what is hilarious is the voice acting. You see, the N64 version came out before the means of having much full voice acting on the N64 was around. So they did what they could. They did most of the speech through text bubbles, and that was fine. It's fine, it's a serviceable solution, but the script for this text was a little lacking. So much so that critics at the time did make fun of it for it. Now, you would think if you're going to port this thing over to the PlayStation and you're going to improve this stuff and have voice acting, that someone would say, you know, we should just go in and tweak the script a little bit, you know, accomplish the same results within the game, within the story, but just make it a little less cringy. But either because Infogrames didn't want to do that, or because Example just thought this stuff was hilarious and decided to double down on it, that is not what happened. No, they kept the corny dialogue intact, and it is amazing.
Hi, I'm Fred, and I'm looking for my dog.
A dog. Wait a second, something's wrong here.
Oh, Ethan, I'm so glad you're here. Whatever they're doping my food with is making me weaker than daytime television.
Okay, Ethan. This briefcase is primed to explode once the helicopter ascends 100 feet.
Yeah? What does it do for an encore?
Wait a minute. I know you. You're Ethan Hunt, the mole. Alert! Alert! Freeze, pal. One false move and I'll cut you down like a pine tree.
Excuse me. What? Nothing.
Now, all this stuff would have been a bit of a mark against the game at the time in the 90s, but now it just adds to the charm. The story of this is loosely based on the film, which is a bit of a strange decision to my eyes, but I guess that's what they felt they had to do to make it work. When I say loosely based, I mean there's elements of the film that are in here. Plot does revolve around the knock list is stolen, you end up stealing it yourself. There's little bits of action sequences or scenes that make it over to the game, but they're often executed in drastically different ways or in different scenarios. But you do end up ending the movie-based levels on the train, so that's kind of cool. There is the famous Langley infiltration scene where he accesses the computer. That made it pretty much directly into the game, but that has a few problems we're going to talk about in a few minutes. Strangely enough, this game starts and ends with several levels that are in this random snowy environment that has nothing to do with the movie whatsoever. Basically, up to a quarter of this game has absolutely nothing to do with the movie at all, which is very strange. I don't understand that choice, but again, this game had to be hobbled together in a year from what little they have, so I imagine they just did the best they could. But none of that really matters if the gameplay is tight. How is the gameplay in this game? It's okay. It's not bad. I don't think it's great. Essentially, the gameplay loop for this is you're in these little sandboxes, and you go and collect things, you rub said things on different things, accomplish objective, progress to next level. That being said, there is just enough variety in how the game does it to keep it reasonably fresh. Not fully fresh, but reasonably so. Kind of like a day-old baguette. It's serviceable, you'll eat it. So for instance, quite a lot of the levels will feature the face scanner items. This allows you to take on someone else's identity. These are kind of fun because instead of just collecting a key card, which does happen in this game as well, you have to instead find a person. Now sometimes that person's in an area that you have to sneak to them, sometimes they're moving around, sometimes you have to find a way to draw them out to you, but you're looking for a person. Then you beat them up, then you steal your face, and now it changes the dynamic of the level, because before this, you might have had enemy guards that would shoot at you or that you had to hide from. Now you can interact with the enemies and get to places you couldn't before. It adds just enough flavor to keep it interesting. That being said, while that aspect of the game is pretty good, the combat's a little clunky. The game does have a precise aiming mode where you'd hold down a shoulder button and it gives you a reticle. And this game does support the analog sticks on PlayStation. Unfortunately, the implementation is not very good, so they are not precise at all, which makes aiming really hard. By and large, instead of using the reticle, I would just shoot from the hip because I found it a lot easier to aim just shooting from the hip than actually using the reticle system. So that's the majority of the gameplay. There are a handful of levels that use an entirely different approach. Now, most of these I don't want to talk about because I don't want to spoil them. One in particular comes out of left field in such a strong way that when I first started playing it, I thought I was watching an FMV until Ethan Hunt started getting shot at and I realized, oh, there's a problem here. But now is a good time to talk about that Langley level because it needs to be discussed. Essentially with this, you go down the ventilation shaft. In this version, it's got lasers that you have to avoid. Then you get down, you have to touch the keypad to lock the door, and then you touch the computer to access it, and then you leave. Pretty straightforward. Should be easy. Unfortunately, it runs into a few pitfalls that weren't uncommon at the time. For instance, the lasers are really easy to read horizontally and vertically, but it's nearly impossible to get a sense of their depth just because of the limitations of the graphics. And so as such, you're going to end up hitting these a lot, especially on your first couple attempts. You hit them a couple times and it's game over. You're done. So there's that. On top of that, once you're down there, the controls while you're on the rope are a little interesting. Now, I will give the game credit. For the majority of the game, it does not use tank controls, which was a pleasant surprise. With the exception of this level, you can't just push the stick in the direction you want to swing. No, you will only swing forward in the direction you're facing, and so you have to kind of turn your guy around and push forward to get him to go in the direction you want. And God help you if you even in the slightest bit nudge right or left on the analog because you're going to start swinging wildly. Now this in and of itself wouldn't be the worst thing, except for the little guy who operates the computer will come back. after about 20 or so seconds. And so your options are either to try to get quickly back up into the ventilation shaft without being seen, or just take the L and reload. So what should have been a fun and fairly straightforward level ends up being really frustrating. I died here a lot. A whole lot. But again, this is the exception rather than the rule. The majority of the gameplay is at sandbox style. Now some of that is a little more linear, but by and large it's fine. It's not great, but it's not bad. I was entertained. So what are my final thoughts on this thing? Is Mission Impossible for the PlayStation 1 worth your time? Yeah, I guess. It's okay. It's not great. It's not bad. I had fun with it. There were a number of moments where I'm laughing, sometimes just at how cringy the dialogue is or how ridiculous some of the scenarios are. But it does have a number of clever little touches and little details in it that made me smile and that I genuinely enjoyed. You can tell that Infogrames, even though they were in a pretty big time crunch by the time they got around to working on it and had to work with what little they had, even though the circumstances weren't great for them, you can tell they tried. They cared about this, they tried to make the best of it, and I respect that. I think it's a fun game, I think they did well with it for the circumstances, and I would say if any of this footage or this discussion is interesting to you, then yeah, give it a playthrough. It'll only be a few hours, it's not a terribly long game, but I think that works nowadays to its benefit. It doesn't overstay its welcome. You definitely are going to want to use save states though for this one, which the game actually has built in, which is fascinating. I've never seen that in a PlayStation game before. But yeah, I think give it a shot. I think it's personally worth your time. And hey, if you don't like it, then don't play it. It is your game after all, should you choose to accept it. Hey, we got our first video done. Sweet. That wasn't as rough as I thought it'd be, actually. Well, nothing to do now but plan the next one. I wonder if there's any other movies coming out in July that I could tie a video into. Let's see here. Oh. Oh no. Oh God. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you at all are interested in seeing more reviews of retro 3D games like this, then please subscribe. Especially as a new channel, it helps us out a lot. But in any case, thanks again and have a good one.